This is the Italian Real Estate Podcast, here to help you with the ins and outs and basics of Italian real estate, presented by ItalianRealEstateLawyers.com. Hello there, and welcome to another episode of the Italian Real Estate Podcast, presented by ItalianRealEstateLawyers.com. Of course, we are back at it again with Italian attorney Marco Permunian. How are you doing today?
Good, how are you?
I am doing great, thank you. And in today's episode, we wanted to do something a little bit different. We wanted to talk about maybe some of the things that are a little bit different about Italy than what many may expect, or some of the things that they don't tell you about before moving to Italy. And we've made a list of different topics that are in no particular order, but one of the things that always is interesting to me, especially somebody who really loves languages, has to do with the dialects that people in Italy speak. So for example, like where Marco is from, many people speak in their own local dialect. So Marco, can you maybe tell us a little bit about dialects in Italy and kind of the realities of living day to day, speaking Italian versus speaking dialect?
A lot of our clients who are interested in moving to Italy, they ask us what's the best way to learn Italian. And that is, of course, advisable if you want to relocate to Italy. Speaking Italian, of course, is very important, even if some people will be able to speak English to you. But what comes as a surprise is that a lot of Italians tend to speak dialect. And there are different dialects in the different regions and areas of Italy. Within a certain region, there can be several dialects or several forms of the same dialect with different variants and different ways in which the different words are pronounced. So, of course, you can expect to have Italians who can only speak Italian, Italians who can speak both the dialect and the Italian language, and some Italians, especially the oldest, who maybe in certain areas can only speak dialect. And understanding dialect is not easy. It can be harder depending on the area. It can be harder in some areas compared to other areas. And at times, it can even sound as a completely different language.
Yeah, for me as a second language speaker of Italian, and a very imperfect speaker at that, I have a much more difficult time for many of the accents that are maybe, say, from Florence and south of there. Like for me, my ear is more attuned to hearing more northern dialects of Italian. But even then, there are aspects of dialects and accents that I even sometimes have a difficult time with. I mean, even I'll admit, in the area where I used to live, your home area, Rovigo, and that province, that there are many people who speak the local dialect, and in such a way that even in Italian, that they'll have an accent that at times I had to listen very, very close to make sure that I was understanding them correctly. But I mean, even I remember we had a conversation one time. I think we were sitting out for an aperitivo somewhere in Rovigo, and you mentioned that even for you could tell even sometimes what high school somebody went to just by the way that they speak.
Yeah, and like you just mentioned, at times, depending on the area, the dialect, it almost sounds like a completely different language where words have a different meaning. So a word in Italian is pronounced or is even written completely different in dialect. And some other areas where the dialect is closer to the Italian language and it only affects your accent. So there are several different types of situations depending on the region or the area in Italy that can either influence the way in which you speak Italian, maybe the way in which you pronounce words, or if you're speaking dialect in certain areas, you're almost speaking a different language. And also something that you can keep in mind is that you can expect the maybe older generations to only be able to speak dialect. So people that have a hard time speaking the proper Italian language, like, for example, my grandparents, they tend to speak dialect, the Veneto dialect, on a regular basis, so on an everyday basis. So in a way where, speaking the regular Italian language can be at times be challenging, just because, people who are older generations, they're used to live in a certain area, and that's probably peculiar of Italy, where people who live in a certain area don't move around. They try to be there for a long period of time. But again, that applies to the older generations and not as much to the younger generations, which are the generations that you can expect to be able to, on the other hand, speak only Italian and not be able to speak dialect. So maybe they understand dialect, but they cannot speak it, or they choose not to speak it. As at times, speaking only dialect can be perceived as maybe lack of proper education, which is, of course, not the case, or not always the case. But that's why the younger generations maybe choose not to speak dialect, or maybe they never learned it, or they can understand it, like I said, but they cannot speak it.
Yeah, it's something that's always really interesting to me. I mean, even something I've joked about, maybe not so much on camera, but many people move to Italy, they prepare, they get ready to speak Italian, and they spend time learning Duolingo or whatever app they end up using. And then they get to Italy, and then they find people they can't speak Italian with. And it's like they get really surprised that, like, wait, hold on, I thought I went to Italy. I thought people speak Italian here. It's not like in many other nations where, for example, like in the US, the television really neutralized the way that people have spoken. I mean, there are new dialects that are even popping up in this day and age. But in Italy, people have held on to their cultural identity in a very strong way. But even so much so that it's not just dialects that you find, but also even separate languages. I mean, there are pockets of Italy where you find German speakers, Serbian speakers, French speakers. I mean, even there's an Italian dialect of Albanian that's very old that is only really heard here in Italy. But just on the topic of languages, to keep on going on our list, in regards to day-to-day life, and especially for people coming from the US who may not already speak Italian, that is the ability to be able to use English in the country. I think some people are often surprised by how often they might be able to use English, or how little they might be able to use English in the country.
Yeah, if you're speaking to a younger individual, you can expect that person to be able to speak English or some English, but that's not always the case. At the same time, you can expect older people to not be able to speak English. But like I said, even outside of the most famous Italian cities, you can expect younger individuals to be able to speak English. Of course, that has to do with the fact that a lot of people, young people, they watch maybe television, or they interact on social media, and they read news in English, which is something that didn't happen in the past. So older individuals were not exposed to that. So they were not exposed to the social media or TV series that are maybe only in English and that younger people tend to watch. So that is also, of course, a factor that has allowed younger individuals to learn English more quickly, but also that has been taught in the public and private schools more often than in the past. Even when I was younger, English was not as popular as maybe French or even German in some areas as the main foreign language that was taught in school.
Yeah, it's really interesting to me to see also how different places in Italy will also cater more maybe towards one language or another language, more depending on as well some tourists that might be coming there. For example, like around Lake Garda, you might find that you find a lot of friendliness towards German speakers, just friendliness in the regards of being able to use the language or having menus or signs in German, for example. Or if you go towards France, that maybe around Lago Maggiore, you might find more signs in French over there. Or, I mean, you go to Alto Adige, Südtirol, it's definitely German up there. There's no doubt about that. But also I've been noticing as time has gone on, even how certain services and certain websites cater more and more towards those who can speak English. I mean, even for example, Amazon.it did not have an English version of the website for many years, and you couldn't have any type of customer service in English as well. But more recently, you've been able to use a translated version of the website and even have customer service in English, which is quite new. And for me, I'll admit, was very surprising as well. I mean, there are some banks even that you find that they do have an English version of their app, but maybe mixed with some Italian at times. But to move on to the next topic, regarding taxes, I mean, this is a factor of life wherever you are. And I think when it comes to even certain things like certain property taxes or how things are handled, like who pays what tax and when and where and how and why, that it can be a little bit of a surprise to people who are thinking about making Italy their home?
In Italy, we have a very peculiar system in place where if you're buying your first home in Italy, and if you're moving your residency into the property within 18 months from the purchase, then the registration tax applicable to the transaction is much lower. So you end up paying a 2% tax calculated on the value on paper of the property, the so-called cadastral value, which would be instead the 9% if you were buying a second home or if you're not moving your residency into the property within 18 months from the purchase. So there's a system that basically gives a considerable tax discount to first home owners, but only people who are actually using the property as their primary residency. These people can also avoid having to pay the annual property taxes, which, of course, other people have to pay, people whose purchase does not fall into the special category that I just described. So if you are a first home buyer, there is a non-insignificant tax discount. And of course, people should be aware of the fact that that only applies to people who move their residency to Italy. And that's very important, of course, for foreign buyers. The tari is a tax that needs to be paid by people who own properties and live in those properties, or people who live in properties that they're renting from somebody else.
Well, thank you, Marco, for explaining the taxes in Italy. And just another thing that can be interesting for people and a little bit different than what they might be used to in other countries. And actually, I think there is something that can be really nice about this is that if you are moving into an apartment building, not all of your neighbors will be living there full time. I mean, okay, that could be happening anywhere, but some of your neighbors may actually be places of business and not other residents.
I believe that's definitely something that a lot of people would not be expecting. But if you are going to live in a unit within a condominium complex, like you said, you can expect to have some businesses in the same building. For example, I was talking to one of my clients recently, and he was telling me how he was surprised that in his building, besides having other residential units, there was a dentist on the first floor and an insurance on the second floor. So it's very common in Italy, especially in the historic centers, to have, like you said, buildings where maybe most of the units are residential units, but some of those units were converted into commercial units. So it's not unheard of, absolutely not unheard of, to have businesses that basically operate inside buildings that also include residential units. And there is no clear distinction between areas that are only for businesses or only for residents in a specific building. It could easily be that the two are mixed together.
It is interesting to me how the zoning laws work in Italy, or maybe even sometimes lack of zoning, which I think in some ways is really nice to be able to see property being used to its maximum potential, and even to not have to go as far for, I don't know, even for purchasing food, to be able to go to the supermarket and maybe having things in a much smaller area around you. But I mean, even I know of maybe something, it doesn't need to be convenient, but for example, I know of a printing press in Milan that is located in the basement of a giant tall apartment building. And even in that apartment building, most of the apartments have residents that live there full time, but there are some offices also sprinkled in, mixed into the equation there. So Italy, space is used in sometimes a very different way. I mean, sometimes maybe it's not going to be that a whole area is zoned as one thing, but a specific unit will be zoned for specific usage, which can also be changed at a later date. But one thing also that I've noticed is that many people come to Italy with a certain expectation that maybe things are not so safe. But in all reality, Italy can actually be much safer. And I think even in many regards, or maybe every regard as far as safety and crime go, ranks much higher and much better than the US.
Yeah, definitely. For example, homicide rate, of course, we're starting from the worst type of crime, but in Italy is considerably lower than it is in other countries like the US. For example. And a lot of people have certain misconceptions about Italy, maybe due to how Italy at times is or was represented on TV or maybe on some movies. But the reality is that the types of crimes that we have in Italy as of today are mostly petty crimes. So we can definitely say that Italy is a very safe place. And of course, in every country, there are areas where the number of crimes is maybe higher compared to other different areas. But considering Italy as a whole, we can say with absolute certainty that Italy is a very safe country compared to other countries, like, for example, the US.
Well, Marco, I have to say this has been a fun episode to get into some of these topics that we normally don't really get into here on the Italian Real Estate Podcast. But if those of you who are tuning in are interested in more episodes like this, be sure to let us know down in the comment section below here on YouTube. But of course, Marco, if anybody is needing help to make Italy their home, how can they get in contact with you and your team?
People can contact us through our website, italianrealestatelawyers.com, or give us a call. Our numbers on the website.
Absolutely fantastic. And of course, if you're interested in more content like this, be sure that you're subscribed to this YouTube channel as well as the audio only podcast. But of course, if you're subscribed to this YouTube channel, then that means also that you're automatically subscribed to the Italian Citizenship Podcast, as well as Ask the Italian Lawyer, a couple of other projects that Marco and I collaborate on where we talk about some of the legalities of making Italy your home, as well as other legal topics that have to do with day-to-day life in Italy. And also, if you're interested in more about life abroad and living abroad, be sure to check out my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Rafael Di Furia, or you can search for Not Your Average Globetrotter on YouTube or your favorite podcasting player of choice. But of course, we have been here again with Italian attorney Marco Permunian for another episode of the Italian Real Estate Podcast presented by ItalianRealEstateLawyers.com. I'm Rafael Di Furia. Stay safe and healthy out there, and we will see you all next time. Later.
Thank you.